So welcome to today's Lunch and Learn, Racism and Reconstruction in New Jersey, led by Dr. Walter Greason. My name is Sarah Brown, and I am the Executive Director at the Center for Holocaust, Human Rights, and Genocide Education. And before I continue, I want to recognize that our center is housed on the occupied territory of the Lenape people. For those of you who are new to Chhange, welcome. We do Lunch and Learn programs every one Wednesday, middle of the month, every month, and it has been tremendous. It's been a wonderful success, and we're so excited to have Dr. Greason join us for this one. Our center has been working now for the past 41 years to promote the elimination of anti-Semitism, racism, and all forms of prejudice through innovative education about the Holocaust, other instances of genocide, and also key human rights issues. In normal times, our efforts include innovative educational programming like film screenings and talks, our exhibit about the Holocaust, the Armenian genocide, and the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, our 6,000 volume library, which is dedicated to Holocaust and genocide studies, and our Holocaust and genocide archives, which is the only one in the state. For now, our center remains closed because of the pandemic, and we have gone fully virtual, in large part thanks to my small but mighty team. And at this point, I believe that actually this program is our 40th program that we have put on since going virtual in March. And we have now reached well over 30,000 people, which is just incredible. And again, thanks to my team for this and our incredible volunteers and. Please visit our website, www.chhange.org. That's Chhange with 2 H's, to learn more about our virtual Lunch and Learn series, our available resources to support virtual learning and teaching, and our calendar of programs. And someday soon, we hope to welcome you back to visit our center. Now, Chhange programming occurs because of the generosity of our members and also program participants like you. So please consider joining Chhange as a member or contributing to support this and future programming. And all of that information can be found on our website. Also, after this session, you will receive an email of additional resources as well as a link so that you are able to watch this Lunch and Learn. So if you miss something, don't worry, we will be posting it later. Now, a couple of just quick housekeeping items. You will note that your audio is muted. But your chat feature is enabled. So at the end of the presentation, if you have a question, please, we want to have a lively question and answer session. So please type your questions into the chat box and feel free to use the chat box throughout the talk to communicate and reach out to other community members and educators who are joining us today. Okay, so thank you to my Chhange staff, Nicole and Allie, for helping to make today possible, and a very warm thank you to Dr. Walter Greason for joining us today. Dr. Greason has a pretty impressive resume. I'm going to keep it brief and just share with you that he is Dean Emeritus of the Honors School and an Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Educational Counseling and Leadership at Monmouth University in West Long Branch. He has written or edited 6 books on slavery, segregation, and anti-Black racism in a global context, alongside major contributions to other manuscripts. And his new immersive educational experience, Sojourner's Trail, teaches participants about the Black speculative arts movement and the history of Afrofuturism. With that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Greason, and I am going to mute myself and hand the reins over to you. And I'm so much looking forward to today's conversation.
Thank you. No, it's a great pleasure to be back here with you. Thank you so much for organizing these events. The center is one of the most important institutions in the region, and I'm glad to be a part of the team to help more people come and participate and learn these important histories and prevent the kinds of disasters that we've seen in the past. So I appreciate especially your flexibility this morning. Like everybody, the pandemic had an impact on my children's education this morning, and lots of technology crashed. And so I had to make some very dramatic changes very quickly, but I hope I will be coherent as I put together this presentation for you guys today. And I will say up front, I do have a website where a lot of these materials are available, beyond just being face-to-face or on a Zoom call. The walterdgrayson.com is a quick way to kind of catch up with all the things we're going to talk about today, and delve deeper to get into more details if you're more interested. So on race and Reconstruction, I'm going to share my slideshow. I hope everybody can see. Let's see. Everybody's okay? Good. Thank you so much. So this is one of the topics that got me most interested in history as a profession. And it was something that I really had never heard anything about, or very little about, as I came through high school, that there was a civil war. Civil war is probably, along with World War II, the two most studied topics that are written by any historians, especially professional historians. These kinds of conflicts that shape nations and reorder world affairs, people love to write about them, people love to read about them, and it holds most of the public's attention. In contrast, most of the material I study early in my career as a social historian were about processes, were about the ways that things slowly change and evolve over time. And I would say even before that, before beginning my career as a social historian, I was interested in intellectual history and the way ideas and people who are philosophers essentially debate the ideas that shape the world. And so that intersection is not as popular to write about. Intellectual and social history has become more popular in the last 50 years, but it's largely because of a shift in the emphasis of what evidence we collect that goes back to W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction. And that's going to be a large part of what we talk about today, is the idea of what was Reconstruction in the United States and how did it make us begin to rethink some of the core assumptions about ideas like race. So that's the foundation of what I hope to discuss a little bit today. And again, if you're interested in getting more into this, the book I put out related to this content in 2018 is titled Industrial Segregation. And it's been a lively debate. In fact, I'm most honored that the folks at the 1619 Project have found the material useful and framed a lot of the way they do their historical inquiry around the principles in industrial segregation. But that book essentially stops us from doing something that happened for a long time, that we understood segregation as either de jure, that is Latin for by law, or de facto, and it just is practiced by custom. And so we need to really start today breaking these paradigms about the way segregation is understood. And I'd say the work I do on social media, that's the main reason I went there, is that I saw so much discussion of slavery rooted in the Civil War conversation that I was like, we're not paying attention to segregation. We're not going into the way that segregation actually started following the American Revolution in terms of formal policies and laws. And then how did that begin to evolve and set the table for what would follow the Civil War? What would follow the open hostilities with the Confederacy is adoption in the South and nationwide of segregationist policies that had existed in the North and the Midwest back to the beginning of the 19th century. And because we never understood that, then we were at a disadvantage, and the Jim Crow era of the 19th and 20th century was bound to take root and not just shape the United States, but would shape Europe, would shape South Africa, would come to dominate the way the world economy would form in the 20th century, is rooted in a lot of segregationist ideas that are linked with industrialization and linked with the idea of industrialism. And so that's why I approach Reconstruction with great reverence, is that the kind of, I won't even say pre-capitalist, but early capitalist forms of slavery and anti-Black racism begin to entrench themselves in very insidious ways in the industrial order that emerges in the mid 19th century and comes to define what the 20th century is. So that's the heart of my work. And industrial segregation offers a quick way to get into understanding all of it. The core of what we're going to do in the next few minutes is about this Du Boisian idea of Black Reconstruction. And so I'm going to walk through several points about how we've understood Reconstruction in American history. And then I'm going to share a lot of the more recent debates about the nature of the United States evolution through the second half of the 19th century, and try to challenge and provoke some questions that will animate our conversation over the next few minutes. So let me start by just summarizing how when we did little bits of work on Reconstruction, how we've approached it. The basic premise, as we have fought to teach it for the last 50 or 60 years, is that Reconstruction happens from the end of the Civil War through the election of 1876. In particular, it's the signing of the peace treaty in Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, that then sets the table for how Confederate states will begin to rejoin the Union. And that's literally the perspective of what Reconstruction is understood as. It's how are the Southern states to be reconstructed to rejoin the United States and the notion of a new union. How does this union then cohere? How does the society begin to come back together? And it carries a lot of unspoken compromises, and some of them are very clear and very obvious, but we teach it in ways that overlook the kind of longest standing successes of the Reconstruction era. And so we start with Andrew Johnson, who is Lincoln's vice president, and his desire to accelerate Reconstruction, to restore a Southern order that's very similar to what had shaped the Confederacy in 1865 and 1866, and failing. That largely the Republican Party that had supported Lincoln prevents him from just wholesale returning to the status quo prior to the conflict. And in 1866 wins massive victories, goes on to impeach him, and then ultimately turns a more radical agenda that's enacted over his objections up through 1868. And this is called radical Reconstruction. And it's you see the Southern states divided into multiple districts. The US military occupies the major population and commercial centers. And there are debates. And then probably the single biggest debate that people still look at is the idea of land redistribution. And so this question of 40 acres and a mule, and how the military began to propose in South Carolina that there would be a more equitable distribution of the economic resources across the South. This was one of the great promises that goes unfulfilled through the Reconstruction period. And as a result, with the compromise to not engage in land redistribution, in summer of 1866, the first Ku Klux Klan is formed. The Klan is then dedicated to using using violent tactics to drive Republicans back out of the South, to restore white supremacy as the basis of government, and are effective. There are just constant campaigns for almost a decade across the South to restore the Democratic Party to power and to make the smallest possible compromises with federal authorities about the fair treatment of formerly enslaved people. This, of course, culminates in the 1876 election of Rutherford B. Hayes as a Republican. But it's notable because Samuel Tilden, as a Democrat, was the first Democrat to essentially win the popular vote since prior to the Civil War. And there's basically a compromise where Hayes is disputing electoral ballots. I know this might still sound too close to home, but that process leads to Hayes getting to the electoral ballots from 3 states so that he's confirmed as the next Republican president. But his promise upon taking office would be that he would withdraw all federal troops from the South and Reconstruction would end. And so that's the traditional understanding of the Reconstruction process in terms of federal and state policy. The single biggest takeaway that people focus on are the constitutional amendments, and we could do an entire other lunch talk about each of these individually or collectively. But the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, adopted in 1865, 1868, and 1870, respectively, these essentially change the fundamental premise of what the United States is as a country. In terms of the 15th Amendment, you're talking about what people simplify as the abolition of slavery, with the most notable exception as a punishment for incarceration, that if you are jailed, you may be legally re-enslaved. The 14th Amendment is something I talk about in lots of my writing and in many presentations, that it essentially extends the idea of equal protections of the law through due process to all Americans individually. The only equal protection prior to the 14th Amendment was the equal protection of the states from the federal government. Applying individual equality protected by the federal government completely reinvents the concept of what the United States is. It is probably the fullest promise of what Reconstruction intended to accomplish, is the 14th Amendment. And the 15th Amendment is about the voting rights, about enfranchisement, and essentially is a compromise to say that there are illegal ways to exclude people from the right to vote. Is based on their parentage, their nationality, their birth. You can't take away people's right to vote based on previous condition of servitude, their parentage, or the fact that of their racial identification. And so very important, because the fight continues, as we see on the 100th anniversary this year, that women are very notably excluded still as a legal category that cannot be permitted to vote. But the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, these are the attempts by the radical Republicans to set in law an idea that all Americans have an equal claim on the promise of a free society. And the irony is that it often obstructs the success of Southern Democrats, of the terrorists in the Ku Klux Klan, to engage in what they called redemption, which was the violent removal of Black and white Republicans from state and local government during that decade between 1866 and 1876. And that redemption process sets the table for another century, 10 decades of white supremacist dominance of the South as a region. And that does not even begin to be challenged until almost the end of the 20th century. And so redemption is part of the traditional narrative that gets very, very little coverage, because people don't want to engage in the very difficult questions about how legitimate local governmental authority is developed and why violence really prevails. It's like the antithesis of what we see in the American Revolution. In this case, instead of the British being driven out by the colonial forces under George Washington, it's the folks who are loyal to plantation society that are successful in retaking the southern states and driving out anyone who wanted to have a more free and open economic system, particularly that would treat people of African descent fairly. So that's the traditional teaching. And again, I use traditional in quotes because even teaching that is a struggle. Prior to 1940, there was only mythology. There was only the celebration of the Ku Klux Klan as a triumphant force that saved Western civilization from the hideous prospect of racial equality. So we spent the better part of 70 years reinforcing the redemption narrative as a nation. And that led to all kinds of just poisonous, deadly social consequences, really up to the present day. What I hope to challenge everybody with, and I'm going to spend a little bit more time on these points, is a more expansive and emergent definition of Reconstruction. how do we see it not bound by the specifics of the military conflict or the political legislation that was enacted, but instead look at the ways people's on the ground daily lives changed, a kind of demographic and economic history of Reconstruction. And that presents some stories that align with the traditional narrative, but also help us look at democracy in a different light, to look at what it means when individuals stand up to challenge state power. And how does that begin to unfold? How does that change the nature of what it means to be free? Which again, I think has very important implications for where we're going in the next decade and for the next century here in this country and around the world. But this emergent look at Reconstruction, really the way it's been taught, starts with the Dred Scott Supreme Court decision in 1857. In this decision, it's an extraordinary piece of legal opinion, jurisprudence that attempts to end the debate over slavery that had really divided the Republic back to 1820. You could argue that it even had divisive impacts back to the foundations. In fact, its impact does predate the Constitution. It goes back and attempts to rewrite the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And so the Dred Scott decision, essentially written by Supreme Court Chief Justice Roger Taney, spells out in no uncertain terms that the Republic is only for white men, that the only people represented by the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were white men, and that there was no attempt and no justification to extend the promise of equal rights, especially to people of African descent. And so it makes the notion of racial equality not just unacceptable, but ridiculous, something to be rejected out of hand and denied on every grounds possible. And so this decision in particular roils or disturbs the Northern and Midwestern communities that had, while still racist, still exclusive, did not believe that the promise of an equal society should be that severely restricted, and that in fact, they should not allow the government to say that slave ownership should be permitted anywhere and everywhere, that essentially the northern states must now also become part of the system of slavery that they had resisted for generations. And so it's that decision, it's that statement that goes out across the Republic that more than anything else energizes people to believe in the abolitionist claim that there should be a freer and more open society, that in fact the slave power was attempting to dominate and limit the freedoms of all people. This enrages and expands the sense of urgency for radical abolitionists like John Brown. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry had been conceived prior to the Dred Scott decision, but he began to plan and aggressively recruit to participate in that mission over the 2 years following Dred Scott. And so Brown's attack, it's astonishing kind of in its audacity. Even the most fervent abolitionists like Frederick Douglass kind of stepped back from it and shied away from what would happen if Brown was successful. But Brown conceived of a way to kind of gather a small militia in the hills of West Virginia, and then to strike from the kind of mountainous territory, engage in a form of guerrilla warfare that would attack federal arsenals and rearm and resupply themselves, and then attack isolated plantations with large numbers of enslaved Africans and adding them to the militia. So the goal was to start in Virginia and raid large plantations that are closer to the riverbeds, return to the mountains, and then continue moving south through North Carolina, through Georgia, through Kentucky and Tennessee, down into Alabama and Mississippi, and essentially, in a small scale way, undermine and disrupt the entire system of enslavement, of cotton production, and the abuse of African labor. And so it takes what had been earlier attempts of local revolts by Africans to overthrow slavery, whether you look at Denmark Vesey or Nat Turner, but does this in a much more strategic and organized way that's predicated on the actual military and political development of these slave states. And so very famously, of course, the Harper's Ferry raid fails. They are captured, pinned down. Brown is ultimately tried and executed for treason. And this begins to make him a martyr in the eyes of abolitionists, certainly, and even folks who have more moderate claims to kind of say that the extension of slavery should not be permitted. The idea that John Brown had a strategy and a technique to begin to destroy slavery as an institution seemed to be an excessive, but a effective way to undermine this threat of nationwide slavery, permanent slavery as part of the United States. And so not only was it received as this kind of, inspirational is the wrong word, but like an affirmation against the wrongness of slavery, it becomes the sense of threat that drives the nascent Confederacy to believe that everyone in the North and the Midwest was out to destroy them. So the story of Brown, where it provides a way to resist the slave power in the North and Western states. In the South, it's seen as an organized attempt where every person outside of the region was attempting to destroy them. And that's what drives the paranoia in the election of 1860, that Lincoln, and not just Lincoln, but also Stephen Douglas, are seen as insufficient ways to defend the traditions of the Southern agricultural system. And so that is one of the huge factors. And you could argue Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe drove that same idea, but that the South could only survive by separating from the North and the Midwest. And so as that process unfolded following the November 1860 election and through March and April of 1861, once the Articles of Secession are drafted, you begin to see the sense of oncoming conflict grow within the South. And there's a lot of really good history on the side of the Confederacy talking about how communities mobilized, the debates, most obviously when West Virginia secedes from Virginia because they don't want to be part of the Confederacy. But even among border states, places like Maryland and Kentucky, Missouri, where essentially there was deep division about remaining in the Union or becoming part of the new country, that all is unfolding within white society, within the South. The stage that really starts Reconstruction, and this is the heart of Du Bois's thesis in the Black Reconstruction text that he wrote, is essentially what he refers to as the general strike. That you had 4 million enslaved Africans that in large numbers just stopped working. They would not continue to be this kind of docile, complacent labor force that supported the way the Confederate society hoped they could persist over time. In fact, you see by harvest season in the end of 1862, little over a year into the conflict, that the system is breaking down. Confederate cities are not able to feed themselves. Inflation is ramping up upwards of 70%. They're attempting to maintain a military, but the foundation in forcing people to work and kind of keep order can't be done. And so as Union forces are moving through Maryland and Virginia and moving through the Western territories down the Mississippi, towards Jackson and across Alabama, you're seeing thousands of African Americans fleeing to the Union lines and forcing the question of how will the Union Army deal with this? And so the process throughout 1862 is this debate of what is the role of the African or the African American in the conflict. They are literally, by their choices, forcing a reconstruction of the South during the course of the conflict. This, of course, provokes Lincoln in September and October of 1862 to draft the language of the Emancipation Proclamation and then publicly make the announcement, and it goes into effect in January of 1863. This is a lesson we don't teach enough, that the regular people at the bottom of the Southern society, just by choosing to stop work and to connect with their families and to not comply with the way the local political and military authorities sought to keep them in line, they forced the Union Army, they forced the Union government to then respond with a military strategy to say that if this is a territory in rebellion, those people are now free and must be treated as free. Too often we talk about the Emancipation Proclamation in terms of its limitations, that it didn't apply to border states, that it didn't apply to free African Americans in the North and in the major cities across the Midwest. But the strike for 90% of enslaved Africans that are held in rebel territory, the statement that the invading military could, in fact, wherever they seize control, recognize the freedom of Black people. It's unprecedented. There is nothing like it prior, even during the Revolution. Promises by the British Army to grant freedom to American slaves is not comparable in scale. And so the proclamation through 1863 is literally beginning the reinvention, the reconstruction of the South. And so that turns the table and sets the foundation for what then follows. When we see the radical Republicans in Congress look at free people reuniting their families, coming and trying to organize work, trying to put together their own marketplaces, the Freedmen's Bureau becomes a federal way to support school systems, contracts, the formations of new Black institutions through Black churches across the South. This is the process that is the antithesis of the Ku Klux Klan. And if we don't teach the Klan enough, I'm constantly reminded that the Freedmen's Bureau is something almost no one understands. They have bought the mythology of the redemption government, that they were illegitimate and corrupt institutions that had to be destroyed. When instead, what we ended up creating in the 20th century was largely a fulfillment of the Freedmen's Bureau idea, where there are public institutions like fire stations to protect people's property, where there are schools and churches that function to help people come together and engage in self-care, self-defense, the ways that they kind of build healthy places where they achieve their dreams. The Freedmen's Bureau was in some ways a large-scale attempt to implement a social work agenda that really didn't have a comparable corollary in the 20th century until the 1960s. You could probably look at Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty as an extension, an expansion of the Freedmen's Bureau platform. And you could argue today that we still need this in the 21st century to help struggling communities find their way forward in competition in global markets, so they can at least have economic stability and not be overcome by poverty and addiction and unemployment. But the Freedmen's Bureau was the initial template for that. And so teaching that lesson, teaching the way that levels of government collaborate to enable people to find a way to build better lives, that's one of the greatest opportunities. It's one of the greatest achievements of the Reconstruction period. But beyond even that, because that's still a government policy, a government strategy that's being implemented in response to the general strike and the response of the Emancipation Proclamation. The core of how I think we need to understand Reconstruction is the idea of reunion. And I take this from a colleague, David Blight, who's written eloquently about the origins of Memorial Day, that it was African American and Republican communities across the South celebrating the Union's victory. That was a kind of organic celebration of freedom that eventually is adopted as an official federal holiday. But the reunion period from 1865 to 1881 invents the idea of free communities for all people. That reunion period is where you're seeing people reject the plantation structure. They're rejecting the ways that agriculture and trade had to operate in the South for the previous century, back to the American Revolution. And the reunion tradition does not win the day. Of course, Jim Crow dominates it and kind of contains it within segregated areas. But at the same time, within those segregated areas, people are building institutions. They're building organizations that ultimately come to shape what we think of as the Black freedom struggle or the civil rights movement. These organizations, in the reunion moment, there's been nothing written, absolutely nothing that's widely circulated, especially to talk about African American and indigenous communities, anti-racist communities in the South that then maintain this period, this 13, 14, 16-year window to try and say there's a different vision for the South, there's a different vision for the nation and the world. And I think we're in a moment right now where the United States and the world are in dire need of the lessons of reunion. How do we come back together? How do we speak to each other openly and honestly about building new communities together? And it's that work that makes me really honored to be a part of this conversation today. This is what I hope we can talk more about in the question and answer in the comment period, but it's what I know people at Brookdale are doing. I know it's what my department and my school does at Monmouth University. And there are tens of thousands of organizations nationwide and worldwide that are doing this. So I ask you guys to take seriously the idea of an emergent new study of Reconstruction, that we look past the kinds of divisive hatred and violence that we've seen for years, and we really imagine a better day in the 21st century where we can come together, support each other in the ways that some of these places tried to 140, 150 years ago. So yeah, questions and comments. I think I may have gone a little long, but I hope we still have time to talk more.
First of all, no, don't apologize. I was riveted and I had to stop taking notes in order to even unmute myself because um, it's so interesting to think that we're well past a century and a half ago. We're looking back to moments in our history and pulling forward, hopefully, or we need to pull forward the lessons that we can carry forward to help us even today as we're experiencing um, a period of turmoil and divisiveness here again in the United States. The idea that you're touching on something that I always make the argument when I began studying the Holocaust and instances of genocide in the 20th century. You know, I always said I don't study them just for their historical value. I study them because they bring lessons with them that we need to carry forward to make our present day better and our future better. We can learn from these things. And if we don't, and it's not just the negative cautionary tales, but also the positive messages. These examples that you're talking about reunion, there are positive lessons that need to be learned, not just the beware and do not do, but also we need to emulate this. I mean, think about the period post 1865, how divided the country literally, truly was after this violent civil war. Being able to come forward and focus on reunion, it's such a great lesson. I really appreciate this talk. And that was my very long way of saying that we are now going to open it up for conversation. And already I'm seeing questions popping up. So Dr. Greason, I don't even get to exercise my executive privilege and ask a question. I'm going straight to these. Here's what first question from Linda. During Reconstruction, what methods were used to persuade or force formerly enslaved people to continue to work lands where they had been formerly enslaved?
So, of course, I mentioned the Klan and the threat of violence that people can be, injured or killed, their children kidnapped. There's any number of violent tools. Most of my work is on the economics of these periods. So an easy first answer is that, say you are a freed person and you're attempting to farm 10 acres or 20 acres. And so you go to the local store to get seeds and fertilizer, tools, a plow, if you happen to have a horse. Many of the folks didn't. They had to drag and push their own plows. Um, to acquire all of that, you would be borrowing on credit, and not the way we think of it with credit cards, but essentially promising a portion of whatever you produce to the people who lent you the seeds and the fertilizer and the tools. And routinely, the people who would lend the items would charge exorbitant interest rates, usurious rates that are 20 and 30 and 50%, sometimes higher. And so eventually, if it wasn't in the first year, certainly within 2 or 3 years of that process, the people who were borrowing would be in so much debt that they could never escape it. And so that they would be forced to work for the person that they had borrowed from at the start of the process. And so the kind of economics continues to be a way that we force people kind of into a form of poverty that compels them to work in ways that they might not otherwise choose. And so that's just one kind of quick example that's well documented. But yeah, the combination of the violence and then the kind of usury that became endemic across the region would force families. I mean, like I said, some of the scariest stories for me are how small children are rented out and then ultimately are kidnapped and sold away and rented away from their families. And so, no, there are just thousands of really horrific stories where people are forced back into slavery, but they don't call it slavery any longer. And that doesn't even mention anything about the jails and the prison system.
Thank you for providing more details about what is a horrific part of the history. We have another question. This is from Jim. How did participants on both sides of the political aisle, Democrats and Republicans, in New Jersey seek new ways to remember the war in order to best serve their political needs in the decades that followed? And then did they use historical memory as a means to sustain the social and racial order in New Jersey after the war?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the person who asked it has a number of answers they could share as well. And so um, what I want to say basically about New Jersey, and I would expect a lot of people in here by this point know this, but when I started doing my work, almost nobody was talking about it. New Jersey is the only Union state that voted against Lincoln, both in 1860 and 1864, and is a state that aligned itself strongly with the Confederacy, both during the conflict and long after. And there are lots of reasons for why New Jersey was committed to a kind of different vision than what the more radical Republicans in Pennsylvania or Massachusetts sought to imagine. But within New Jersey, the sense of compromise that took hold among moderate Republicans, New Jersey was really a leader in terms of its congressional delegation for moderate Republicanism against radical Republicanism after 1868. And as that process unfolded, when you do that kind of 6 to 8 years up till the election of 1876, New Jersey elected officials wanted stability to preserve the way their state economy would work and the way the large property owners would continue to kind of thrive going forward. And so it's this piece where New Jersey was starting to industrialize, had in Newark and Trenton, and to a lesser extent Camden, had kind of thriving commercial industrial centers, but at the same time was committed to preserving rural landholding, places that we consider suburbs now that were strong farming enclaves well into the 20th century, especially around a place like Lincroft, like just enormous commitment to maintain land holding and to resist banking, to resist the power of banks as part of the way the social landscape would evolve. And so when you talk about the compromises with white supremacy overtly, that common ground in the 1870s and 1880s in New Jersey was so powerful that you get a place like Long Branch is probably my favorite thing to talk about. Is today we still have a park called Seven Presidents Park in Long Branch, right up on the beach. And it's because it was the tourist destination for all of these moderate Republicans and Democrats, people who had a lot of money and wanted to come and party and gamble, engage in all kinds of vices that they had. They came to Long Branch at Monmouth Park was the center of it. And in large part, for a generation, for 50 years, those coalitions of very wealthy, very elite political players and authorities found common ground in white supremacy, in denying women the right to vote, and kind of building an industrial order that respected the of of agricultural land ownership. And they all came together in this region, and to tell the common story, to keep a core message that it was Christian to maintain this kind of hierarchy. That's the dominant narrative that led to the creation of a very famous figure you'll know is Woodrow Wilson. As his family comes up from the region, they connect to this elite class of people in the late 1890s and are, not impressed with the Republican vision that comes from William McKinley, and certainly not from Theodore Roosevelt. And as he becomes governor and is a strong leader for the state, his popularity in taking limited reform ideals combined with this kind of commitment to white Christian authority carries him sufficiently so that he wins a very narrow election in 1912, but ultimately is successful through that American involvement in the First World War in translating those values into the way the United States would become a world power. And so those pieces about compromise and how people build a kind of culture of solidarity around the rejection of radical republicanism, that's a really important story of the late 19th century, but especially at the core of New Jersey. I still to this day have folks who make those same appeals in conversations, and it's 2020. They still want to kind of attach to the same idea and the same tradition.
I have so many questions just based on your answer, but I'm going to stick to the many questions that have popped up since. Joseph asks, can you please elaborate on the Freedmen's Bureau? Was it federal or implemented at the state level? Was it for all states or for the southern states? And are there ways that it might be a model even today?
Thank you. Great question. One of my favorite things, and I write about it whenever I get a chance. Yeah, so the Freedmen's Bureau was authorized by Congress within the former Confederate states. It was the institution designed to reimagine how these states would rebuild and would become part of the Union again. So it set an important template and precedent that the federal government would basically provide the funds and the supervision through the Senate and through the House to begin county and state level implementation of these organizations. And that those folks working with the Bureau would then attempt to, with sympathetic local populations, attempt to redesign local government and local economy. Now, were it to be successful, it would have completely redesigned the Southern system. We would have had a completely different idea of the Southern states going into the 20th century. But of course, the Klan was extraordinarily successful in destroying anything associated with the Freedmen's Bureau and curbing their ambitions so that they would not try to kind of construct, but so much that would change the social order. And so there are just some amazing films. I saw a spectacular website about the schools that were built by the Freedmen's Bureau that are essentially one-room schoolhouses, and they're following. I see you, Gene. Those projects to kind of establish how do you give people coming into freedom their first chance. Not only was it, even in its limited success, tremendously important, but beyond that, when you look at any of the New Deal programs, especially the second New Deal programs, when you're seeing the Works Progress Administration, when you're seeing people begin to build institutions nationwide, all of this is built on the same kind of ideological structure. How do you actually provide a path into the future for people who are in danger of being left behind? And what are the ways we structure opportunity that it's accessible to the greatest number of people? So those are the benefits of something like the Freedmen's Bureau. But I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, in the context of the United States' greater global ambitions, these same strategies were applied in really damaging ways in Cuba and the Philippines, ultimately in Japan. A lot of the kind of neo-colonial structures of how we change people's social behaviors and habits intellectually as conquered countries. If you just go, I don't know if maybe I can share it later. If you look at the placement of our military bases around the world, we have an entirely different structure of how we project American power in Asia, in the Middle East, in Africa, South America. Those bases are essentially direct derivatives of what the Freedmen's Bureau was. And then we use them in much more aggressive ways to make sure our influence is not displaced. If there had been the same determination with the Freedmen's Bureau in the South that there has been to keep American authority in place in a place like Manila, it's an entirely different outcome. And so those visions of how we project our authority, combining military and cultural strength, I think we can have long conversations about what's good and what's bad about it and how we do better going forward.
All right, I'm going to do kind of a lightning round. I'm going to throw you a couple of questions because there's so many. By the way, I have to thank everyone. These questions are excellent. One is, you mentioned the unfulfilled promises of the Reconstruction era was that land distribution didn't happen, the 40 acres and a mule. What are some of the other unfulfilled promises, and how could we maybe address them now in contemporary society? That's one. Can you elaborate on the numbers of people who may have been re-enslaved as a result of punishment for so-called criminal acts, which that's a great question. And then I'll throw one more in. Jean asks, since I'm an educator and I teach about the role of education in my African American history course, can you speak about the importance of free public education that was pushed by African Americans in the South and for all?
Say that last one again.
Can you speak about the importance of free public education and the role of African Americans in pushing that, not just in the South, but also for everyone else?
Absolutely. So there's a lot. There's a lot in there. I'm going to try and go quickly. No, it's all good. The piece on public education, they're just extraordinary. The idea that we have public education in this country, period, is a product of the Freedmen's Bureaus and the schools that they set up in the South. There were local school systems in places like Boston and New York and Cleveland, but the idea that free public education for all children under the age of 17, like that is an enormous public benefit that distinguishes us in the world. We should all go back and look at Reconstruction just to say thanks for the fact that we have such a strongly educated population. Gosh, I lost the other two. Can you go let me see, they're in the chat. Let me see.
Oh gosh, the chat's got a lot of questions. One of them was about what are some of the other unfulfilled promises of Reconstruction? So one was land distribution, and how could they be addressed even now?
Yeah, so let me do that quickly because I do a lot of work on that. I just published an essay in the Washington Post about the next step we can take on that topic. And so what I'm working on right now is I have a coalition of about 2,500 historically Black or Indigenous communities that have been grotesquely underdeveloped nationwide. And if we put 1% of the funding that we put into the national park system to maintain the plantations as tourist destinations for weddings, we could entirely restore all of these lost and endangered Black communities nationwide. So if anybody's interested in doing that work, it's connected to what I do at the T. Thomas Fortune House in Red Bank. But we have a chance in the next decade to entirely rebuild the places that have been damaged by white supremacy over the last 150 years.
And we will add that Washington Post article to our resources that we send out, along with all of the other amazing things you've done. There's two people have asked about this. Can you elaborate on the numbers of people who were re-enslaved as a result of punishment for so-called criminal acts? And this ties in with vagrancy laws during the Jim Crow era and how people were imprisoned. Many freed Blacks were imprisoned and then came under these new overseers.
Yeah, again, I imagine everybody is pretty familiar with the abuse of the law under vagrancy codes to prosecute people for being on the corner looking for a job. They could be jailed and forced to work, sometimes for periods as long as their natural life. Also petty crimes, stealing a loaf of bread, just really horrendous abuses of the law to maintain the system, very much like slavery. But when you're talking about numbers of people, so we're looking at nationwide now, somewhere north of 3 million people and actively incarcerated. But that's just with the new Jim Crow. That's just since 1970. When you start to aggregate those numbers going back in time, going back 1960, 1950, 1940, especially in the southern Mississippi River Valley, Arkansas, Tennessee, Louisiana, Mississippi, it's horrendous. It is absolutely horrendous. You have communities that, minimum 25% of their adult male population was jailed on minor charges. In some of the worst cases in Louisiana and some of the smaller cities throughout, I was going to say New Orleans and smaller cities throughout Louisiana, those numbers were upwards of 50 or 60% of the adult male population. If you haven't heard of it before, you want to Google the Angola prison in Louisiana.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's literally named after the region in Africa where people were taken from as they were enslaved, and it's remained dedicated to incarcerating just thousands of Black men throughout its history. So no, the total numbers, you're probably looking at equivalent to what we've seen since 1970, somewhere 2.5 million people over a century incarcerated. But that doesn't necessarily tell the story of locally the absolute decimation of the labor force and the ability to generate wealth in Black communities across the South. And
I'm
also
mindful of our
lynching, where the business owners and church ministers were most of the targets of these kinds of lynch mobs.
I'm mindful of our time, or I would just ask you to spend the next 3 days giving me a very necessary and thorough education about these topics. But I'm going to ask you to take us out with this question, a great question from Marjorie, which brings us a little bit more current. What is your opinion about the influence of social media on divisiveness, and how can we get beyond this time of false information, which has been manipulated and used to divide us?
Doing things like this, doing these conversations whenever you can. You can't do it every day, although I wish we had television and cable that would do these kinds of things as a regular part of our evenings. But at least every week or every month, connect with people of goodwill who have brilliant insights and resources to share. Do it through your school or through your church or synagogue. The way you connect regularly through social media, my work for 7 or 8 years has been just every day, literally 4 or 5 times a day, identifying and connecting with good people online who want to share, who want to give, and have extraordinary gifts to offer. And as you do that, more and more people gather, and then they do things that you could never expect with the connections that they've forged. So take time to connect with people who share your values and are trying to accomplish what we're doing now. And you will be astonished at how far they carry the baton, how far we move forward quickly.
Thank you for that final comment and for sharing so much knowledge. And thank you for your work too. The fact that you're expanding this out, that proposal you were just saying about rebuilding these 250 plus communities, I'm still thinking about this. Thank you. To everyone on this program, thank you for participating, and thank you for asking such excellent questions. We're going to send out a link of this talk, so if you missed anything, don't worry, you'll be able to watch it again. We'll also send out some additional resources, especially some of the many things that Dr. Greason has authored. And please stay tuned with us for the next Lunch and Learn. It will be on December 16th, and it will feature Rabbi Isaiah Rothstein. He will talk about how, as an Orthodox rabbi and a man of color, how those identities have shaped his commitment to move for social justice and be an activist. And for anyone who doesn't know, please do consider joining us for our December 3rd gala. That will feature we'll be honoring survivors and their descendants. And we also will have Stan Kasten, the president and CEO, I believe, of the World Series champions, the LA Dodgers. He's also a local Jersey boy who did well, and the son of local Holocaust survivors who are near and dear to Chhange. And so please join us then too. And I'm going to leave it with that. And thank you everyone for being here. Have a wonderful day. A connected day.